Iranian naval doctrine was not designed to defeat the United States Navy in a conventional engagement. It was designed to make victory so costly that the United States chooses not to fight. This is the scenario that keeps Pentagon planners awake. In this hypothetical analysis, we examine the volatile dynamics of a confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway where geographical constraints and asymmetric tactics would likely challenge the technological supremacy of the United States Navy. In this scenario, a United States carrier strike group, centered around a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, would likely be operating in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf. If this engagement were to occur, the strike group would consist of the carrier itself, or at least one Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, and 2 or 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. This formation represents the pinnacle of 20th and 21st century naval engineering, specifically designed to project power across thousands of miles of open ocean. However, in the narrow confines of the strait, where the navigable channel is frequently less than 2 miles wide, that same power would likely be compressed into a tactical environment that favors a smaller, more agile opponent. Wargame analysts suggest that the opposing force, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, would not attempt to meet the carrier group in a traditional ship-to-ship battle. Instead, Iranian doctrine indicates a reliance on asymmetric warfare, utilizing hundreds of small, high-speed attack craft, midget submarines, and land-based anti-ship cruise missile batteries. If these forces were to meet, the Iranian objective would likely be a mission kill, rendering a multi-billion-dollar platform, like the carrier or an escort cruiser, incapable of continuing its mission even if the vessel remains afloat. Based on known capabilities, defense analysts believe that the threat of a mission kill is the primary driver of naval strategy in this region. The fundamental question of this analysis is whether the Aegis combat system, which serves as the primary shield for the carrier, could successfully manage a saturation attack. If 30 to 50 Iranian fast boats were to converge simultaneously from multiple directions, they would create a complex radar environment. Analysts suggest that the sheer number of targets could potentially overwhelm the defensive screen's ability to prioritize and engage every threat before one or more small craft could reach the inner defensive layer. This scenario is not about the technological inferiority of one side or the other. It is about the physics of a saturation threshold. If this hypothetical engagement unfolded, the United States Navy would rely on its integrated fire control and the expertise of its tactical action officers. But as many naval exercises have demonstrated, the transition from peace to a high-intensity engagement in a crowded waterway occurs in seconds, not minutes. In this analysis, we will look beyond the raw numbers of ships and aircraft to understand the doctrine, the decision-making processes, and the technical limits that would define the outcome of such a clash. We will explore how the United States would likely defend its most valuable assets, and how the Iranian forces would likely attempt to bypass those defenses using the geography of the strait to their advantage. Based on historical precedent and current military doctrine, the outcome of such an engagement is not a foregone conclusion. While the United States holds a significant advantage in electronic warfare and long-range precision, the littoral environment offers the adversary opportunities to hide and strike from close range. This analysis is based on publicly available information and modeled on the likely behavior of professional military forces. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, such as human error, equipment failure, and the unpredictable nature of combat in a confined space. In this hypothetical engagement, the stakes would be nothing less than the future of maritime security in the world's most critical energy corridor. To understand how a United States carrier strike group would likely defend itself in the Strait of Hormuz, one must first analyze the Aegis combat system. This integrated architecture of sensors and weapons is the most sophisticated naval defense network ever fielded. In this scenario, the Aegis system would serve as the central nervous system for the entire strike group, linking the carrier, the cruiser, and the destroyers into a single, unified defensive bubble. Defense analysts have modeled this system for decades, but its effectiveness in a confined littoral environment remains a subject of intense professional debate. At the heart of the shield is the AN/SPY-1 radar, a phased array system capable of tracking more than 100 targets simultaneously, from sea-skimming cruise missiles to high-altitude aircraft. In a hypothetical engagement, the cruiser and destroyers would likely position themselves as a screen between the carrier and the Iranian coastline. This formation is designed to provide layered defense, where a threat must pass through multiple rings of fire before it can reach the high-value asset. The outermost layer of this defense would likely be the Standard Missile 6, or SM-6. This weapon is designed for long-range interception, capable of striking targets well beyond the horizon. Wargame models indicate that the SM-6 would be the primary tool for engaging Iranian aircraft or large surface vessels before they could launch their own munitions. However, in the narrow confines of the strait, the reaction time for these long-range systems would likely be compressed. If an anti-ship missile were launched from a shore-based battery only 20 miles away, the SM-6 might only have seconds to achieve a kinetic kill. If a threat were to penetrate the outer ring, the second layer of defense would likely consist of the evolved Sea Sparrow missile, or RIM-162. This is a medium-range, highly maneuverable interceptor designed specifically to counter supersonic anti-ship missiles. In this scenario, the Aegis system would likely manage the launch of multiple Sea Sparrows to ensure a high probability of kill against every incoming projectile. But herein lies the first major vulnerability identified by defense analysts: the depth of the magazine. Each Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries 96 vertical launch system cells. While this sounds like a significant number, in a saturation attack where 2 or 3 interceptors are fired at every incoming threat, those magazines could likely be depleted in minutes. The final, inner layer of defense is often referred to as the last-ditch protection. This consists of the rolling airframe missile and the close-in weapon system, or CIWS. The CIWS, a 20mm Gatling gun capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, creates a literal wall of tungsten shells. In this hypothetical analysis, the sound of the CIWS activating would signal that the outer layers of the Aegis shield had failed to stop a threat. While the CIWS is highly effective, it has a very short range, typically less than 2 miles. At this distance, even if an incoming missile is successfully intercepted and destroyed, the resulting debris and kinetic energy could still cause significant damage to the ship's superstructure, resulting in a mission kill. Analysts believe that the greatest challenge for the Aegis shield in this scenario is not the quality of the technology, but the sheer volume of the data in the Strait of Hormuz. The radar environment is cluttered with civilian tankers, fishing dhows, and commercial aircraft. If an engagement were to occur, the Aegis system would have to distinguish between a harmless fishing boat and an explosive-laden fast craft in a matter of heartbeats. This clutter provides a natural form of stealth for an asymmetric adversary. Furthermore, the Aegis system's radar-based guidance requires a line of sight. Iranian doctrine calls for the use of geographic masking, where land-based launchers or small boats hide behind the numerous islands and jagged coastlines of the strait. This would likely force the United States Navy to rely on its airborne assets, such as the E-2D Hawkeye, to provide over-the-horizon targeting. Without these eyes in the sky, the Aegis shield would be reactive rather than proactive. In this hypothetical engagement, the technological sophistication of the United States Navy provides a formidable defense. but it is a defense that can be tested by the simple mathematics of a saturation attack. If the number of incoming threats exceeds the number of ready-to-fire interceptors, even the most advanced shield in the world would likely show cracks. If a United States carrier strike group represents the hammer of conventional naval power, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy represents a cloud of hornets. In this hypothetical analysis, we must examine the specific asymmetric doctrine that the Iranian forces would likely employ. This doctrine is not born of a lack of sophistication, but rather a calculated strategic choice to exploit the inherent limitations of a high technology. Blue water fleet operating in the shallow, cluttered littoral waters of the Strait of Hormuz. In this scenario, the primary threat would likely come from what analysts call the swarm. This involves dozens, or perhaps even hundreds, of fast attack craft and fast inshore attack craft. These vessels, some as small as 15 feet and others reaching 60 feet in length, are often powered by high-output outboard motors and capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots. While a single boat armed with a heavy machine gun or a few unguided rockets poses little threat to a destroyer, the sheer volume of 40 or 50 such boats converging from multiple vectors would likely create a tactical nightmare. Iranian doctrine calls for these swarms to approach from different directions simultaneously, attempting to find a gap in the strike group's situational awareness, or to overwhelm the targeting computers of the close-in weapon systems. Beyond the visible swarm, defense analysts have modeled a significant undersea threat, the Ghadir-class midget submarine. These vessels are approximately 29 meters long and are specifically designed for the shallow, high-salinity waters of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. In this hypothetical engagement, these submarines would likely operate in a sit-and-wait mode, resting on the seafloor in key choke points. Because they are small and operate in an environment with high levels of ambient noise from commercial shipping, they are notoriously difficult for the sophisticated sonar of an Arleigh-Burt-class destroyer to detect. If a carrier or a cruiser were to pass within range of an undetected Ghadir, the submarine would likely launch its two 533mm torpedoes or deploy sea mines. Even a single torpedo hit would likely result in a mission kill, forcing a multi-billion-dollar ship to withdraw from the engagement for extensive repairs. Analysis suggests that the Iranian forces would also utilize their significant inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles. Weapons like the C-802 and its indigenous variants, the Noor and the Ghadir, are capable of being launched from mobile trucks hidden along the rugged Iranian coastline. In this scenario, these shore-based batteries would likely coordinate their fire with the fast boat swarm. If the strike group were busy engaging dozens of small boats at close range, they might not detect the launch of a sea-skimming cruise missile from behind a coastal ridge until it was mere seconds from impact. This multi-axis attack combining surface craft, subsurface threats, and shore-based missiles is the cornerstone of Iranian naval doctrine. Furthermore, the adversary would likely leverage the geography of the region to its advantage. The Iranian coastline is dotted with numerous small islands, such as Keshem and Abu Musa, which provide natural cover for their forces. Iranian doctrine emphasizes geographic masking, using these landmasses to hide the radar signatures of their fast boats and missile launchers until the moment of engagement. In this hypothetical scenario, the United States Navy would likely face a pop-up threat where an Iranian flotilla appears from behind an island at a distance of less than 5 miles, leaving the defensive screen with almost no time to react. War game models indicate that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is a highly professional and disciplined force that trains specifically for this type of high-intensity, short-duration clash. They understand that they cannot win a prolonged war of attrition against the United States. so their goal is to strike hard and fast, causing enough damage to achieve a strategic victory through tactical success. Analysts believe that this cost imposition strategy is designed to shock the American public and the international community by proving that the most advanced naval vessels in the world are vulnerable to low-cost, mass-produced weapons. In this analysis, the asymmetric swarm is not viewed as a primitive force, but as a sophisticated answer to the challenge of facing a global superpower in a confined space. If this engagement were to occur, the outcome would likely depend on whether the Iranian forces could maintain coordination under the pressure of intense American electronic warfare and counterfire. In a hypothetical engagement in the northern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, the first phase would likely be defined not by the roar of engines, but by a tense, silent struggle for situational awareness. If this scenario were to unfold, the United States carrier strike group would likely transition to a high state of alert long before entering the most restricted waters. Defense analysts suggest that the detection gap is the most dangerous window of time, where the line between peace and conflict is blurred by the presence of hundreds of civilian vessels. In this scenario, the carrier strike group would likely be surrounded by an environment that naval analysts describe as hyper-cluttered. On any given day, dozens of massive crude oil tankers and hundreds of small fishing deos transit these waters. Iranian doctrine indicates that the Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely use this civilian traffic as a form of human shielding or environmental masking. War. Game models suggest that Iranian fast attack craft would likely mingle with civilian DAOs, keeping their high-speed engines at low revolutions to minimize their acoustic and thermal signatures based on known capabilities. The United States Navy would likely respond by pushing its sensor horizon as far forward as possible. This would likely involve the launch of MH-60 Sierra and MH-60 Romeo helicopters. These aircraft, acting as airborne sensor nodes, would likely use their multispectral targeting systems to visually identify every small craft within 30 miles of the carrier. If this engagement were to occur, the pilots of these helicopters would be the first to face the identification problem. In a hypothetical encounter, a tactical action officer aboard a destroyer must decide in seconds if a fast-approaching boat is a lost fisherman or an explosive-laden strike craft. Doctrine suggests that the United States would likely employ non-kinetic warnings during this initial phase. This could include laser dazzlers, bridge-to-bridge radio warnings, and low-altitude flyovers by FA-18 Super Hornets. However, analysts believe that the Iranian side would likely test these rules of engagement by pushing multiple small craft into the strike group's keep-out zone simultaneously. If this occurred, the defensive screen would be forced to choose between maintaining its defensive formation or dispersing to intercept individual boats beneath the surface. The detection gap would likely be even more acute. Analysts have noted that the shallow, high-salinity waters of the strait create a complex acoustic environment where sound waves bounce off the seabed and the thermal layers of the water. In this scenario, a Ghadir-class midget submarine could likely be resting silently on the seafloor, completely invisible to the active sonar of a passing destroyer. If the submarine remained powered down on its batteries, its acoustic signature would be virtually indistinguishable from the background noise of the strait's heavy commercial traffic. The first contact in this hypothetical engagement would likely not be a missile launch, but a geographic pop-up. Iranian doctrine calls for fast boats to wait behind the cover of islands like Keshem or Hormuz. As the carrier strike group reaches a specific waypoint, these boats would likely accelerate to their top speed of over 40 knots, closing the distance to the outer screen in less than 3 minutes. Wargame analysts suggest that this sudden transition from a peaceful transit to a multi-axis The threat is designed to induce cognitive overload in the command team of the carrier. If these forces were to meet, the decision to fire the first shot would likely be the most scrutinized moment of the engagement. United States Navy doctrine emphasizes the right to self-defense against hostile intent. But in the crowded Strait of Hormuz, determining intent is an analytical challenge. If 5 fast boats were to break formation and sprint toward a destroyer, the tactical action officer would likely have less than 60 seconds to authorize the use of force. Based on observed exercises, this initial moment of contact would likely define the tempo of the entire engagement. If the U.S. forces hesitate, they risk a mission kill from a close-range strike. If they fire too early, they risk a strategic escalation that could have been avoided. This detection gap represents the primary tactical advantage of an asymmetric adversary in the littorals. In this scenario, once the initial threshold of hostile intent is crossed, the engagement would likely transition instantly from a tense standoff to a high-intensity missile exchange. Defense analysts have modeled this phase as the saturation opening, where Iranian doctrine would likely call for the simultaneous launch of multiple land-based anti-ship cruise missiles. These weapons, such as the Noor or the longer-range Ghadir cruise missile, would likely be fired from mobile transporter erector launchers hidden in the rugged, mountainous terrain along the Iranian coast. If this scenario unfolded, the primary objective of these initial salvos would not necessarily be to sink the carrier immediately, but to force the United States Navy to deplete its limited magazine of interceptors. Each Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and Ticonderoga-class cruiser carries a finite number of missiles in its vertical launch system cells. Analysts believe that by launching a wave of 20 to 30 sea-skimming missiles, the adversary would likely force the Aegis system to respond with a 2-to-1 interceptor ratio. This means the defensive screen might expend 40 to 60 Standard Missile 2s or Standard Missile 6s in just the first few minutes of the engagement. In this hypothetical engagement, the missiles would likely approach at subsonic speeds, hugging the surface of the water to stay beneath the radar horizon of the ships for as long as possible. Based on known capabilities, the Aegis combat system would likely detect these threats only after they crest the horizon, leaving the tactical action officers with approximately 60 to 90 seconds of reaction time. Doctrine would call for the destroyers to position themselves to provide area defense, using their SP-1 radars to guide interceptors toward the incoming threats, while the carrier itself maneuvers to present a smaller target profile. As the first wave of missiles enters the outer engagement zone, the air would likely be filled with the sound of vertical launch system cells firing in rapid succession. War game models suggest that the United States Navy would likely achieve a high kill probability against these initial threats, but the cost would be measured in more than just dollars. Each interceptor fired is a cell that cannot be reloaded while at sea. In a confined space like the Strait of Hormuz, there is no rear area to retreat to for replenishment. If the Iranian forces can sustain multiple waves of fire, they would likely reach a point where the American ships have more incoming targets than they have ready-to-fire interceptors, while the missiles are in the air. Analysts believe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely use electronic warfare to further complicate the defensive picture. This would likely involve land-based jammers attempting to blind or spoof the Aegis radars, creating ghost targets or masking the true trajectory of the incoming cruise missiles. If this occurred, the United States Navy would likely counter with its own electronic attack suites, such as the AN/SLQ-32, to decoy the incoming missiles away from the high-value hulls. The escalation would likely place an immense psychological and technical strain on the command teams. In this Hypothetical scenario. The decision to fire must be delegated to the Aegis system's auto special mode, where the computer makes the final determination to launch interceptors based on preset parameters. Human reaction time is simply too slow to manage 30 simultaneous threats coming from 3 different directions. This is the moment where doctrine meets the limits of human-machine integration. Analysts suggest that even a 95% success rate in this phase could be catastrophic. If 24 missiles are intercepted, but one leaks through the defensive screen, the result could be a mission kill on a billion-dollar destroyer. If that destroyer's radar or vertical launch system is damaged, the entire strike group's defensive bubble would likely suffer a significant gap, making the next wave of the attack even more dangerous. In this analysis, the missile salvo is viewed as the softening phase, designed to strip away the carrier's shield before the surface swarm and subsurface threats make their final run. The objective is not a fair fight. It is the calculated depletion of American defensive capacity through the mathematics of saturation. In this hypothetical scenario, the engagement would likely reach its most critical juncture, approximately 10 minutes after the initial missile exchange. Defense analysts call this the saturation point, the moment where the physical and technical limits of the Aegis combat system are tested by a multi-vector, multi-domain assault. If this scenario were to unfold, the United States carrier strike group would likely find itself facing 3 distinct threats simultaneously. The remaining wave of cruise missiles, a high-speed surface swarm, and a potential subsurface strike. Wargame models suggest that the primary technical bottleneck for a United States destroyer in this moment would likely be its fire control channels. While the AN/SPY-1 radar can track hundreds of targets, the older variants of the Arleigh-Burke-class and Ticonderoga-class cruisers rely on a limited number of illuminators to guide certain versions of the standard missile to their final impact. If 30 fast boats and 10 cruise missiles were to enter the inner defensive zone at once, the system's ability to light up every target would likely be stretched to its breaking point. Analysts believe that this is the specific gap Iranian doctrine is designed to exploit. As the Iranian fast-boat swarm crosses the 5-mile threshold, every close-in weapon system in the formation would likely activate simultaneously. In this hypothetical engagement, the sound of multiple 20mm Gatling guns firing at once would be audible 10 miles away. Based on known capabilities, the United States Navy would likely employ its own Mark 38 25mm chain guns and M2 50 caliber machine guns to provide a wall of steel against the encroaching small craft. However, defense analysts have noted that these manual and semi-automatic systems are subject to human fatigue and the chaotic motion of a ship maneuvering at high speed. Doctrine indicates that the Iranian flotilla would likely execute a BIC coordinated dispersion, where boats break into smaller cells of 3 to 5 craft. If this occurred, the defensive screen would be forced to split its fire, potentially leaving a narrow corridor open for a single explosive-laden boat or a short-range torpedo from a Gadier-class submarine. Analysts believe the critical moment would likely hinge on whether the Iranian commanders can maintain their discipline under the devastating fire of the carrier's escort ships. If even 2 or 3 boats can penetrate the inner ring within the same 60-second window, the probability of a successful strike on a United States hull increases exponentially. At this stage of the hypothetical engagement, the carrier itself would likely be conducting emergency flight operations. Wargame analysts suggest that the carrier would attempt to launch every available MH-60 Sierra helicopter to act as swarm hunters. These helicopters, armed with Hellfire missiles and door-mounted machine guns, would be the primary tool for thinning the swarm before it reaches the carrier's hull. However, in this hypothetical, the helicopters would likely be operating in a high-threat environment. facing shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles from the very boats they are hunting. The turning point of this critical moment would likely be defined by magazine management. If the destroyers have already expended their primary interceptors against the initial missile salvos, they would likely be forced to rely entirely on their close-in systems. In this scenario, defense analysts suggest that a leaker, a missile, or boat that survives the defensive gauntlet would likely target the ship's soft infrastructure. This includes the radar arrays, communications antennas, and bridge windows. A hit to these areas would not sink the ship, but it would likely result in a mission kill, effectively removing the vessel's ability to defend itself or the carrier. Based on historical precedent and current modeling, this is the point where the advantage could likely shift toward the adversary. If the Iranian forces can sustain their pressure for just 5 minutes beyond the Aegis system's optimal replenishment rate, they would likely create a tactical opening. Analysts believe that the outcome of the entire engagement depends on this 300-second window. In this analysis, the critical moment is a test of which will fail first: the Iranian will to sustain heavy losses in the swarm, or the American capacity to track and engage every target in a cluttered 360-degree combat environment. This is the ultimate test of layered defense in the modern era. In this hypothetical engagement, the exchange represents the moment when abstract doctrine is replaced by the violent reality of kinetic impact. If this scenario were to unfold, defense analysts believe that both sides would likely suffer significant and sobering losses within a matter of minutes. This is not a scenario of invulnerability for the United States Navy, nor is it one of total annihilation for the Iranian forces, without a tactical cost. It is a period of high-intensity attrition based on wargame models. The Iranian fast boat swarm would likely pay a devastating price to reach the inner defensive layer. As the MH-60 Sierra helicopters and the carrier's escort ships open fire with 25mm chain guns and 50 caliber machine guns, dozens of small craft would likely be neutralized. In this scenario, analysts suggest that as many as 20 to 30 Iranian vessels could be destroyed or disabled before they ever close within range to use their own munitions. The loss of life among the Iranian crews would likely be heavy, reflecting the high-risk nature of their asymmetric doctrine. However, for the Iranian commander, this loss is often viewed as a calculated trade-off to achieve a single, high-value strike. While the Iranian swarm is being thinned, the United States Navy would likely face its own moment of extreme vulnerability. If this engagement occurred, defense analysts believe at least one leaker, a sea-skimming cruise missile, or an explosive-laden boat would likely penetrate the final defensive screen of a United States destroyer. In this hypothetical analysis, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, operating at the edge of its radar capacity, and with a depleted vertical launch system, would be the most likely target. A single hit from a Nor cruise missile or a heavy torpedo from a Ghadir-class midget submarine would likely result in a mission kill. In this scenario, mission kill means the ship remains afloat but is no longer a combat-effective unit. A strike to the hull would likely cause significant flooding and electrical failures, while a strike to the superstructure would likely destroy the SPY-6 radar arrays and communication masts. If this occurred, the destroyer would be forced to withdraw from the engagement, creating a massive hole in the carrier strike group's defensive bubble. This loss of a primary escort is a scenario that wargame analysts have identified as a high-probability outcome in a saturation-style attack. The carrier itself, the Nimitz-class center of the group, would likely not be immune. While the carrier is the most heavily defended ship in the world, the Sheer volume of a coordinated attack means it would likely face near-miss or fragmentation damage. If a cruise missile were intercepted by the close-in weapon system at a distance of only 500 yards, the resulting explosion would likely shower the flight deck with high-velocity debris. Analysts believe this could result in damage to parked F/A-18 fighter jets or the carrier's catapult systems. Even minor damage to the flight deck would likely halt flight operations, effectively neutralizing the carrier's primary weapon, its air wing, and completing a strategic mission kill for the Iranian forces. Doctrine indicates that the United States Navy would likely respond with overwhelming force once the exchange begins. F/A-18 fighters and B-1B Lancer bombers, if available in the region, would likely begin targeting the shore-based missile batteries and the command and control centers on the Iranian mainland. However, the exchange at sea would be defined by the Winchester State, a military term for being out of ammunition. If the destroyers have emptied their magazines and the carrier's flight deck is fouled by debris, the strike group's posture would likely shift from offensive power projection to a desperate struggle for survival and withdrawal. Historical precedent suggests that in such a confined space, the side that can absorb the first blow and still maintain its command structure holds the advantage. In this hypothetical engagement, the United States Navy would likely maintain its professional cohesion, but it would be doing so while managing hundreds of casualties and multiple damaged platforms. Simultaneously, the Iranian naval leadership would have to contend with a near-total destruction of their first-wave flotilla. This is the honest loss phase of the analysis. The realization that in modern naval warfare, even the victor would likely return to port with ships that may never see combat again. The exchange proves that in the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of engagement is not measured in fuel or time, but in the permanent loss of multi-billion-dollar assets and the crews who man them. In this hypothetical engagement, the true weight of the United States Navy would likely be felt during the air wing counterattack. While the escort ships and their Aegis systems provide the shield, the carrier's air wing is the sword. If this scenario were to unfold in the Strait of Hormuz, the carrier would likely attempt to launch every available asset to suppress the Iranian shore batteries and neutralize the remaining fast boat swarms. Wargame models suggest that this phase would be a high-speed, high-stakes operation where the air wing attempts to regain the tactical initiative. If the flight deck remained operational despite the initial exchange, the first aircraft into the fray would likely be the MH-60 Sierra and MH-60 Romeo helicopters. These aircraft, often referred to as the first responders of the strike group, would likely be tasked with the immediate defense of the carrier's inner perimeter, armed with Hellfire missiles and door-mounted machine guns. These helicopters would likely engage the Iranian fast boats at close range. Analysts believe that the MH-60 Sierra is particularly effective in this role due to its ability to hover and provide sustained, accurate fire against small, maneuverable targets. However, in this hypothetical, these helicopter crews would likely be operating under the constant threat of man-portable air defense systems fired from the very boats they are hunting. Simultaneously, the carrier would likely launch waves of F/A-18 Super Hornets. In this scenario, these fighters would be configured for surface warfare missions, carrying laser-guided bombs and AGM-65 Maverick missiles. Doctrine indicates that the Super Hornets would likely focus on the Iranian shore-based missile batteries. If these batteries were not neutralized, they would likely continue to fire salvos at the strike group, eventually exhausting the remaining defensive interceptors. Defense analysts suggest that the F/A-18 crews would use their advanced targeting pods to identify mobile launchers hidden in the coastal mountains. But the terrain would likely offer the adversary significant opportunities for concealment and shoot-and-scoot tactics. Beyond the fighters, the E-2D Hawkeye would likely serve as the command and control hub for the entire counterattack. From its position high above the strait, the Hawkeye would likely provide real-time targeting data to the fighters and helicopters, effectively knitting together the various elements of the air wing. In this hypothetical analysis, the Hawkeye's ability to see over the coastal ridges and into the Iranian interior would be the critical factor in suppressing the land-based threat. If the adversary were to successfully target or jam the Hawkeye, the air wing's effectiveness would likely be reduced by more than 50%, based on known capabilities. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps would likely counter these air operations with their own integrated air defense system. This would likely include the use of Russian-made Tor M1 and indigenous Bavar 373 surface-to-air missile systems. Wargame models indicate that the Iranian air defense doctrine focuses on ambush tactics, where radar systems are kept off until the last possible moment to avoid detection by American electronic warfare aircraft like the EA-18G Growler. If this occurred, the United States Navy would likely face a pop-up surface-to-air threat that could lead to the loss of several aircraft. Analysts believe that the air wing counterattack would likely succeed in neutralizing the bulk of the Iranian surface swarm and many of the shore-based launchers, but it would not be a bloodless victory. In this scenario, the United States would likely suffer the loss of several helicopters and potentially one or two fixed-wing fighters to ground fire and mobile missiles. The intensity of the engagement would likely push the carrier's maintenance and ordnance crews to their absolute physical limits. Furthermore, doctrine suggests that the air wing would be tasked with conducting battle damage assessment. If a destroyer in 12 had been mission killed earlier in the engagement, the helicopters would likely be diverted to perform search and rescue operations for sailors in the water, even while the combat engagement continued. This dual tasking would likely strain the available resources of the strike group. In this analysis, the air wing counterattack is seen as the decisive factor that prevents a tactical setback from turning into a strategic defeat. While the Iranian forces can impose high costs through asymmetric strikes, they would likely struggle to survive the sustained, precision-guided retribution that a United States carrier air wing can deliver once it has identified its targets. In this hypothetical outcome, the engagement in the Strait of Hormuz would likely conclude within 4 to 6 hours of the first kinetic exchange. Based on the modeled data, the United States carrier strike group would likely remain the dominant force in the waterway, but it would do so as a significantly diminished formation. This scenario represents a victory for the United States Navy in terms of maintaining the freedom of navigation, but the tactical and strategic costs would likely be viewed as a sobering milestone in modern naval history. Defense analysts suggest that the final status of the American fleet would likely include at least one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer rendered completely mission-killed. In this scenario, the vessel would likely have suffered a direct hit from a cruise missile or a heavy torpedo that bypassed the final defensive layer. While the ship would likely remain afloat due to advanced damage control and the professional training of its crew, its sensors, weapons systems, and propulsion would likely be non-functional. The carrier itself, while escaping a catastrophic hull breach, would likely be forced to cease flight operations due to fragmentation damage on the flight deck and the destruction of key communication arrays. For the United States Navy, this would be a victory with heavy cost, the loss of over $1 billion in hardware, and the tragic loss of dozens of sailors in a single afternoon. On the Iranian side, the outcome would likely be characterized by the near-total destruction of the initial fast boat swarm. Wargame models indicate that as many as 40 to 50 small craft would likely be destroyed. by a combination of the Aegis-controlled guns and the carrier's air-wing counterattacks. Furthermore, at least 3 to 5 mobile land-based missile batteries would likely be neutralized by precision strikes from Fa-18 Super Hornets. While the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would have achieved its objective of proving the vulnerability of the United States Navy, its surface capability in the Northern Gulf would likely be erased for the short term. In this scenario, the winner is a matter of perspective. Tactical analysts would likely argue that the United States achieved its mission. The Strait of Hormuz would likely remain open, and the adversary's primary offensive assets would be neutralized. However, strategic analysts believe that the Iranian cost imposition doctrine would have succeeded in its broader goal. By inflicting visible, high-impact damage on a United States destroyer and damaging a Nimitz-class carrier, the adversary would likely have shattered the perception of American invulnerability in the region. This result would likely embolden asymmetric actors globally and force a fundamental reassessment of how the United States projects power in littoral environments. As the smoke cleared, the carrier strike group would likely be forced to withdraw toward the prize, Gulf of Oman, towing its damaged escort and conducting emergency repairs at sea. The sight of a mission-killed Arleigh Burke-class destroyer being assisted out of the strait would likely be the defining image of the engagement. Based on historical precedent, this image would carry a strategic weight far beyond the actual tactical damage, influencing diplomatic and military calculus for decades to come. The engagement would likely end in a tactical stalemate where the United States holds the field but lacks the immediate resources to conduct further offensive operations, while the Iranian forces retreat to hardened underground facilities to regroup and reevaluate their remaining inventory. In this hypothetical analysis, the outcome serves as a stark reminder that in the mathematics of naval warfare, success is often indistinguishable from catastrophe when the cost is high enough. The United States would have won the battle, but it would have done so at a price that would shock the American public and change the nature of maritime deterrence forever. If this hypothetical engagement in the Strait of Hormuz were to occur, defense analysts would likely spend years dissecting the data to understand how a high-technology fleet was successfully challenged by an asymmetric adversary. Based on the modeled results, this analysis identifies 4 key lessons that would likely fundamentally change naval doctrine in the 21st century. The first and most critical lesson involves what analysts call the magazine depth problem. In this scenario, the United States Navy would likely have found that its vertical launch system capacity is a finite and easily exploitable resource. While an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is a formidable platform, it is limited by the number of interceptors it can carry in its 96 launch cells. If an adversary can launch enough low-cost threats, be they drones, small boats, or subsonic missiles to force the expenditure of these high-cost interceptors, they can effectively disarm a billion-dollar ship without ever achieving a direct hit. This analysis suggests that future naval architecture must prioritize either significantly larger missile capacities or the rapid deployment of directed energy weapons, such as lasers, that do not rely on a physical magazine. The second lesson pertains to the littoral identification challenge. In the cluttered environment of the Strait, the United States Navy would likely have struggled with the transition from peacetime monitoring to wartime engagement. The presence of civilian vessels provided the Iranian forces with a natural form of environmental stealth that neutralized much of the strike group's long-range sensor advantage. Analysis indicates that in a confined waterway, the technological overmatch of the Aegis combat system is mitigated by the physics of the horizon and the sheer volume of non-combatant traffic. This suggests that in future littoral engagements, the most important weapon may not be a missile, but the artificial intelligence systems capable of identifying hostile intent in a crowded radar field. The third lesson highlights the effectiveness of the saturation threshold. Wargame models suggest that every defensive system, no matter how advanced, has a breaking point where the number of incoming targets exceeds the computer's ability to process and engage them. Iranian doctrine indicates that they do not need to be more advanced than the United States Navy. They only need to be numerous enough to find the gap in the fire control channels. If this engagement were to occur, the primary vulnerability identified would likely be the human and technical inability to manage a 360-degree attack in a matter of seconds. This confirms that mass remains a critical factor in naval warfare, even in an era of precision-guided munitions. Finally, the analysis points to the success of geographic masking and cost imposition. By using the rugged coastline and numerous islands of the rugged Persian Gulf, the Iranian forces were able to negate the open ocean advantages of the carrier strike group. This forced the United States to fight on the adversary's terms. In an environment where the carrier's primary strength, its long-range air wing, was compressed into a defensive role, the strategic lesson is clear. An asymmetric adversary does not need to destroy the United States Navy to achieve a victory. They only need to demonstrate that the cost of engagement is higher than the United States is willing to pay. In this hypothetical scenario, the most significant finding is that technological superiority is not a shield against the mathematics of attrition. While the United States would likely maintain operational control of the strait, the damage to its platforms and the expenditure of its advanced munitions would likely leave the fleet vulnerable to a follow-on engagement. This analysis is based on publicly available information regarding current capabilities and doctrine. It underscores the reality that in modern naval warfare, the greatest threat is often the one that forces you to empty your magazines before the real battle even begins. In the strategic vacuum that would likely follow this hypothetical engagement, the global perception of naval power would be fundamentally altered. If a United States carrier strike group were to suffer a mission kill on a primary surface combatant and sustain damage to a carrier, the geopolitical fallout would likely reach far beyond the Persian Gulf. Defense analysts believe that the unquestioned era of carrier-based power projection in littoral waters would likely come to an end, replaced by a more cautious and contested maritime environment. The strategic consequences for the United States would likely be profound. While the Navy would have technically achieved its objective of keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, the sight of a damaged carrier and a mission-killed destroyer being escorted from the theater would likely be used as a powerful propaganda tool by adversaries worldwide. Analysts suggest that this would lead to a period of intense domestic debate regarding the vulnerability of high-value assets. If a multi-billion-dollar platform can be neutralized by a combination of low-cost missiles and small boats, the United States may be forced to rethink its entire shipbuilding strategy, shifting away from a few massive, expensive hulls toward a larger number of smaller, more distributed, and expendable autonomous platforms. For the region, the balance of power would likely enter a state of precarious equilibrium. In this scenario, although the Iranian surface swarm would be effectively neutralized, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would have demonstrated that it possesses a FATO, power over the world's most critical energy corridor. This successful imposition of cost would likely embolden other regional actors to pursue similar asymmetric capabilities. Defense analysts have noted that the Hormuz model of saturation attacks would likely be studied and replicated in other maritime choke points, such as the Bab al-Mandab or the South China Sea. Furthermore, the engagement would likely trigger a rapid escalation in the naval arms race. The United States would likely accelerate the deployment of directed energy weapons and high-capacity magazine systems to counter the saturation threat. Simultaneously, Adversaries would likely invest more heavily in stealthy asymmetric tools, such as autonomous underwater vehicles and long-range sea-skimming drones that can further exploit the detection gap identified in this analysis. The new normal for naval deployments would likely involve much larger escort screens and a significantly higher degree of electronic warfare readiness, even during routine transits. In summary, this hypothetical engagement suggests that while the United States Navy possesses the most advanced combat systems in human history, it is not immune to the mathematics of the littoral environment. The outcome of victory with heavy cost serves as a warning that technology is a multiplier, not a replacement, for magazine depth and geographic awareness. The United States would hold the strait, but at a price that would fundamentally change the calculus of future deployments in this region and beyond. Final analysis summary outcome: U.S. victory with heavy cost. R2. Freedom of navigation is maintained, and Iranian surface assets are neutralized. But one U.S. destroyer is mission killed, and the carrier sustains flight deck damage. Key analytical lessons: the saturation threshold, no defensive system, is absolute sufficient volume, if coordinated across multiple axes, can eventually find a gap in even the most advanced Aegis screen. Magazine depth vertical launch system capacity is the Achilles heel of modern surface combatants, a force that can force the expenditure of interceptors early in an engagement can disarm a fleet before the primary exchange. The littoral advantage geography and civilian clutter provide a natural form of stealth that favors the asymmetric defender, significantly reducing the reaction time for high-technology sensors. Deterrence through damage. In modern naval warfare, inflicting visible damage on a high-value platform can achieve a strategic victory, even if the attacking force is tactically destroyed. This analysis is based on publicly available information regarding weapon systems and naval doctrine. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, including human decision-making under extreme stress, mechanical failure, and the inherent fog of war. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine.